So I'm Lisa. I was a Molly's teacher. I've been at Muss for almost 15 years now. And one of the big things that I talk about is different aspects of Jewish life in Israel. And that means both religiously and also socially, culturally, and what that means. For a little background about myself, I'm from San Francisco. I am an Ashkenazi Jew. My dad is not Jewish and he's Greek, so a little bit of a cultural difference there. And I married a Moroccan Israeli, so I learned a lot very quickly about different cultural aspects, and that's what brought me down this path of what does it mean to have a diverse state. I used to laugh that my mom used to say that Israel isn't very diverse because there were no blonde kids in my kids' classes. And so that got me thinking, okay, so what does it mean to be diverse and what does that look like? So I'm going to break it into kind of three different groups. Now, there are a lot of different groups in Israel, but the three main ones I'm going to talk about are Sephardic Jews, which in and of themselves are a very large group of diverse people, Russian Jews, which again have their own diversity, and then Ethiopian Jews. So those are the three I'm going to kind of run through. I know I speak fast. There's only two of you on, so if you need me to repeat anything, feel free to ask a question. Feel free to tell me to slow down. I'm happy to do any of that. So one of the big things we talk about in the early years of statehood was that most of the very early founders of Israel that we think about were Ashkenazi Jews, right? You think of, I'm actually going to just turn off my share for 1 second before I get on there. You think of, Ben Gurion, you think of Chaim Weizmann, you think of Menachem Begin. These were all Ashkenazi Jews. They were from Eastern Europe for the most part, some from Western Europe. And they kind of built this myth around the creation of Israel. Now, you might have been listening in the news or you've seen on Instagram, this idea of like colonialism, right? The white Jew colonizing the state of Israel. And that is just not a true statement of the population of Israel. Forever, basically, since Jews have been here, there have been a continuous Jewish statehood. We've actually done a DNA test on my husband, for instance, and his DNA dates back to the Syrian Judean area. So there have been Jews here for centuries, millennia perhaps, depending on how we analyze time. But this kind of new movement of the new state was kind of a Western ideal. So when you think of founding a state, you kind of think of this Western movement. And then in the 50s and the 60s, at the early founding of the state, there was a huge influx of Jews from North Africa. Now, Jews from North Africa had a pretty good life under Muslim rule for a very long time, and we'll get a little bit into examples of that later on. But once the state of Israel was founded, there was a huge wave of anti-Semitism in North Africa, specifically in areas like Morocco, Tunisia, in Algeria, and the Jews were kicked out of their homes. My husband's grandfather was thrown into jail. They snuck out at night with none of their belongings and ended up in the land of Israel. Now, it's 1955, let's say. Israel's been a state for all of 7 years. And what do you do when you have a population of 1 million people and suddenly 700,000 people land on your doorstep? And not only that, but as I just said, like they come with no money. They've had to flee their homes, add on to the Holocaust survivors. Now we have these survivors fleeing their homes in North Africa. What do you do with them? One of the most important statements that we see in all of history, really, but in the land of Israel also, is where the plow stops, the border begins. If you're ever going to build a country, you have to protect your borders. And how do you protect your borders, besides the military, is by putting people on them. So that was one of the first ideas of the state, of Ben Gurion. If we're going to build a state and we're not going to protect it, and we have these 700,000 people coming in, where do we put them? We're going to put them in the borders. We're going to put them in Sderot. We're going to put them, I circled Sderot. First of all, it's big in the news now, but you can see it's right on the corner of Gaza, right, which was controlled by Egypt at the time. And I also circled Ahuzam. So I live in Kiryat Gat. That's where I am right now. You can see it right there, right above the red circle of Ahuzam. Kiryat Gat was what we call a periphery city. So this was an area, it was outside of the center of the country. Back then, now it's only about a half-hour drive. Back then it was, a couple hours. And that was an area where they put major textile factories. If you know anything about Israel, like Polgat, which is a textile factory, or major manufacturing companies like Sugat, which does like dried beans. You might have seen it in the grocery store, rice, that kind of stuff. So they would put these in the cities, and then around them they would put periphery towns, Mabarot, which weren't even towns, really. They were shacks, ramshackle shacks in the style of Salah Shabati, if you've ever heard of them. And so they would move the communities out here without asking, right? You would land in Israel, you would have nowhere to go, and you would get in a bus, they'd give you a ticket, and you'd land up in the middle of nowhere. So this is where my husband ended up, his family, in a chuzam, in a shack, basically, outside the area of Kiryat Gat. And they were looked down upon. They spoke Arabic, which was seen as, not high class. They had these funny accents with the ayins and the chets and all these things. They had customs like henna, which was, weird. They dressed funny. They had cultural examples of, dowries that were seen as weird. There were all sorts of expectations. Major founders were said to, talk about, let's say, Romanian Jews as being, high and mighty and too good for the state, but Sephardic Jews were like animals, right? So they were just second class. So they had no real education, even though they did, right? That they had their religion was different. And so they were very much put on the periphery in the north and in the south. They were put in agricultural jobs, even if that's not what they had, grown. If they were, a shoemaker, that, wasn't very helpful, so no one cared. So this is what the Mabrot looks like. These are actually pictures from the area that my husband's family is from the area around Kiryat Gat, the very first city. So again, it was very short-term housing. How can we get the most number of people into these areas and set up very early cities? After Mabrot were built, the next step was to build kind of communist-style housing, right? Apartment blocks that were very simple, relatively small, what we would consider today, right? Multiple kids in a room, but how can we get the biggest population? So these are actually my own personal pictures of the one on the left is my henna party, and then the other two are my sister-in-law's henna party with my own kids. So henna was something that was taken from the local culture. So this is what happens when the Jews live in exile. When you lived in Morocco or Tunisia or Yemen, henna was very much a part of the life cycle celebration of non-Jews. And the Jews took that into their own culture. So this isn't Indian henna, where you might have seen where it's like very detailed, intricate decorations. You just put a dot on your hand, basically, and cover it. But there's these big parties with these marzipan cookies. And this is all part of something that the Sephardic Jews have taken in as part of their culture for centuries to celebrate, the culture they were part of in North Africa. So there was a really negative movement against Sephardic Jews in the 50s and in the 60s. And this first begins to change through music. So there's kind of two major singers that come on the stage that begin to change the kind of national mindset of what it means to be cool. Because if you hit the cool culture, then as a society, you begin to move forward. So the first one is Zohar Argov. Zohar Argov was kind of the first mainstream Mizrahi singer. He's one of those guys that in today's world we would totally cancel because he probably raped women and he has a really bad background. You can go down the terrible hole of who he was. But he was the very first Sephardic singer to get on the mainstream. And because of that, he had a real cult following as kind of this example of Mizrahi music. After him comes Ofra Haza. Now, Ofra Haza you've probably heard of. She sang in The Prince of Egypt, for instance. Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, you might have heard her. But I want to show you just a short clip of one of her first songs that she sang in a movie. Hopefully the technology will allow me to do this because we know this is good. So I'm hopefully going to show you just a short clip of a song called Frecha. Did you guys hear and see that ish? Mm-hmm. So anyone know what the term frecha means? Has anyone heard that term before?
No.
So frecha, I would compare it to I just forgot what's the term, like the Italian, like on the not the Japs, but like in the what's that movie? Jersey Shore, the TV show.
Yeah.
That's like a frecha, right? It's like someone who is like overly make-upped, big hair, big shoes, the whole thing, right? So this idea of a frecha was a term that was used like anti-Mizrahi women, right? That you are shallow and you are overly makeup. The male term is an arse. You might have heard that, which, as you can imagine, is exactly what it sounds like almost in English. You know, it's kind of ass, you know, overly gelled hair and overly muscled kind of thing. So this song is all about, if you heard the Hebrew, it's about a frecha. It basically says like, sorry, some more planes going on. Okay, so the song is about basically saying like, where the lights go, where the planes take me, I just want to dance. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to be like deep. I want to put on lipstick and I want to dance. And that's the name of the song and actually kind of the theme of this movie. And Ofra Haza actually had this big pushback when the director showed her the song and asked her to sing it. She said, I don't want to sing this song, right? Like, I'm a Sephardic woman. I want to like represent a positive light. And she ended up singing it. And she always kind of apologized for it. So like later on when it became really popular and she would sing it in public, she'd always kind of start with like a, you know, this isn't what I think kind of like awkwardness, but it became really, really popular. And I use this as an example, first of all, because it became very much a part of popular culture, but also in the more recent reaction. So a couple years ago, every year there's this thing during Hanukkah, except for this year, called Festival. Festival is like, it's a big show on steroids every year for Hanukkah. All the major famous singers come in, you know, they make their own songs and dances and they tour the country. And a couple years ago, they decided they were going to redo the song Frecha. So they brought in these like famous singers and they redid it. And I'll show you just a bit of it. This one actually has English subtitles, so might be even better. 1 second. Oh. Not that, sorry. I'll get good at this one day. You think after all this time I'd be good at
אין לי ראש למילים ארוכות, ואתה מין מילה ארוכה שכזאת. עכשיו ידידי ודש לחייך, בתקווה שתבין את השמש של פרש קורעת את הים, ואני מפליגה בתוך הקו קופים, לאן שיקחו האורות אני שם, עם הלהקה ליסטיק ושר דאווין. כי בא לי לרקוד, בא לי שטויות, בא לי לצחוק ולא בא לי עליך, בא לי בימים, בא לי בלילות, בא לי לצחוק. כי בא לי לרקוד, בא לי שטויות, בא לי לצחוק ולא בא לי עליך, בא לי בימים, בא לי בלילות, בא לי לצחוק. הבנת?
So did anyone happen to notice what was missing in the song? In the redo?
It sounded like they didn't actually say the word frecha.
Exactly. They cut it out because there was this feeling after the first run that it was like racist, right? That we couldn't actually use that word in popular song anymore. So this song was published, it became a big hit, and then there was a huge reaction to the fact they didn't include the word frecha. And so there was a counter song that was done by a Sephardic group. It's basically a group that empowers Sephardic women to go into like tech and male-oriented jobs. I'm just gonna now play you a little bit of kind of the response to the response of cutting out the word frecha.
איפה קורעת את הים, ואני מפליגה לתוך העקבים.
כשלא מתחשק מעיפה גם אותם,
ונרשמת לקורס בתכנות מחשבים. בא לי לתרום, בא לי לחלום, בא לי תנאים שיסדירו את הפנסיה. בא לי להנהיג,
בא לי להבריג,
בא לי להיות סבתא פרחה. מתקתקת קובד לאט, בגלותן אני לא נוגעת, ציפורניים על הקלואי, ותקליטים של דיוויד בואי. רוצה מחשוף, רוצה שביס,
רוצה להיות מפקדת בסיס.
Come on baby, בוא נקום לסליחות, ואחר כך
So you might notice that here they kind of take the word frecha back, right? And they change all the other words of the song that, yeah, we can be both women who like nails and like makeup and want to go out and party, and also women who are heads of the army and are in computer programming and are in the Knesset and are doing all these amazing things. So kind of taking back this idea of we can be both these things and quote unquote frecha, and still be successful women, right? That it's not a dirty word anymore, that it's something that we can own. And they come back to this kind of idea of safra frecha, right? That this is the culture that our grandparents were in, that we are going to bring back. So that's a little bit about sorry, Side just kicked me out. Don't know why Side just kicked me out. That 1 second, let me reshare now. Okay, hope I'm back because I don't know why it's kicking me out. So not only did they come in through music and culture, but then also through politics. So one of the major leaders, there were kind of two major leaders religiously of the Sephardic movement. At the very beginning, one of the very first ones was called the Baba Sali. The Baba Sali was one of the first leaders of Sephardic Judaism to be recognized among the Ashkenazi community as an equal in rabbinic learning. So if you actually can go to his grave in Ofakim, and you can go and you can pray there, and he's become kind of this first step of being acknowledged by the Ashkenazi movement. After he passed away, Ovadia Yosef comes onto the scene, and Ovadia Yosef is a major religious leader, but he turns around and says, we need to not only have religious, examples and, the cultural examples, but we also need to be in politics. If we aren't in politics, then we don't have anything. We have to represent ourselves. So he founds Shas, Shomrei Torah Sephardim, so this kind of Sephardic movement. And it says that we want to bring the Sephardic religious culture back to Israel and have our own political movement. Now, it's interesting. If you had to guess on Shas's religious leanings, in general, are they right-wing or left-wing?
I guess right wing, but that's only because I kind of assume any highly religious group is going to be more right wing.
So the short answer is they're funny. I don't know if either of you can read Hebrew, but at the bottom, here's a sign. It says Pensia lekol oved. So pension for every worker. So on the one hand, they are right-wing when it comes to things like the current war, right? When it comes to land, when it comes to religious ideology, they are generally right-wing. But when it comes to social issues, they actually swing decently left, because these are people who are generally on the poor side of the communities. They generally have more kids. They generally have a lower education, and therefore they want more social support. They want better education, better schools, better public schools. They want better pensions. They want better working conditions. They want to I don't want to say socialist because they're not exactly socialist, but they want this kind of socialist support for their constituents. So on one hand, they are right. On the other hand, they are very centrist, if not occasionally left. So they are a really interesting party. The Sephardic groups have strongly followed the Shas leaders since the 80s. So my father-in-law, for instance, whether he's right or left, he tends to vote Shas just because he wants a recognition of his culture and religion in the government. Ovadia Yosef died in 2013. You can see the picture here of his funeral. 850,000 people attended his funeral. They say, quote unquote, his followers say it was the largest gathering of Jews since the Second Temple. I'm not sure or not, but that's what they say. When he died, there was an interesting movement because one of his daughters was actually slated to take a position in the Knesset. And then there was this big pushback. She decided not to, because this question of should women in religious parties join the Knesset or not, she decided not to, had a whole statement about it. So there's also really interesting, cultural divide there. Well, one more and then I'll move on. So Mimuna might be one other thing you've heard of here, is Bibi and everyone's celebrating Mimuna. This is one of those last little cultural things. In Passover, we sell our chametz, right? We sell our bread so that we don't own it for the course of Pesach. In North Africa, they would sell it to their neighbors. The Jews would sell it to their neighbors. And then at the end of Pesach, in order to celebrate them getting back and celebrate their good relationship with their neighbors, they created a celebration called Memuna, in which you eat mufleta, which are basically like crepes, kind of, with honey usually, sometimes butter. And they would invite all their neighbors and they would have a big party. So it's become very much a part of Israeli culture today. There's something like 3 days a year where there's no sound ordinances, like where, you know, you can play music as late as you want, as loud as you want. Yom Ha'atzmaut, Lag BaOmer, and Memuna. So that's like an example of just how much this has become a part of the style fabric. If you think about food today, a lot of the food that we think about as Israeli food is Sephardic food. This, you know, idea of a henna, memuna, has become very part of Israeli culture, even if you're not Sephardic. Everyone kind of wants, you know, the henna party. And this kind of, if you might notice, we don't really have a reform and conservative movement, and a lot of this is actually based on this idea of Sephardic religion, that if you ask most Sephardic Jews, it's not the same kind of reform and conservative movements as in America, as in clear-cut religious separation. In most Sephardic cultures, you are Orthodox or you are spiritual, cultural, right? There isn't necessarily a space for something like a woman rabbi, and that has a very strong influence on Israeli culture. Sephardim or Mizrahim are about half the population in Israel today. They are actually at this point more likely to have a higher degree than Ashkenazim Jews. There is still some cultural racism in the sense of, you know, are they Arabs? I'll tell you that my own mother-in-law, when I first got engaged, told me that, oh, I'd make her grandkids white. And there was kind of this like, it's not that I'm not that it would be like a good thing that her grandkids would be whiter and be able to pass a little more in society. My brother-in-law, if you are interested, I can send you more things later. He's the head of Sanchanim, and he's one of the first Sephardic heads of Sanchanim, which is paratroopers, which is traditionally an Ashkenazic group. And the fact that someone with the last name of Biton would be the head of this kind of Ashkenazic elite army unit was a really big, you know, kind of glass-breaking ceiling. So on the one hand, there's a lot of, you know, progress and movement. On the other hand, there's still kind of a separation between the two cultures of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews. That was a lot on Sephardim, but questions, anything I can answer or before I move on to the Russians?
Nope. All good here.
Okay.
All good here too.
Okay. So Russians. Russians, again, similar to Sephardim, are not quite, it's not like there's one across the board. Russian, of course, or the former USSR is a large group of people from actually different also cultural groups themselves. But I am going to kind of lump them all together because we don't have that much time. So I will separate them out a little bit when possible. So let's talk a little about the history of it. Jews in Eastern Europe, for those who've taken the course, or those who know a little bit about Jews in Eastern Europe, millions of Jews exist in Eastern Europe in what is called the Pale of Settlement. So this area in what is today Ukraine, parts of Russia, Lithuania, that kind of chunk of Eastern Europe. And they lived there for centuries. They've had a good life there, a very bad life there. There were pogroms, right, in the early 1900s, and then, of course, World War II. Post-World War II, and in the buildup of, you know, Stalinism and Stalin's Russia, life for the Jews was very, very difficult because communism very clearly says, we don't want any religion, right? Opiate of the masses. We don't want to separate out or to give power to anything beyond the communist community. So Jews were basically told, hide your religion, right? You can't celebrate it. You don't speak Hebrew. You don't practice prayers. And so they were very much, you know, kept quiet, if not in a box. And this was what Stalin's Russia in the 50s was like. Now, in 1948, Golda Meir shows up in Moscow, and she's basically told by all the powers that be, no one's going to come see you. Everyone's really scared. It's really a terrible thing. And she says, no, I have to go anyways. I have to go and I have to show the people of Russia that we are supporting them, that we, the Jews, that we are supporting them and that we are here to help them after the founding of the state of Israel. She's told no one's going to show up. About 50,000 people show up. And it is just, as you can see in the picture, just crowd upon crowd, unable to move. there was this synagogue, this choral synagogue in Moscow. It was overflowing. And she really felt that this is what we have to do. We have to help save the Jews of Russia, that she sees that this group, this community has remained Jewish, and we have to find a way to help support them. And even as she leaves, she says that she's telling people, thank you for coming. Thank you for remaining Jews. Thank you for supporting us. And someone responds to her, you don't understand. Thank you for giving us a reason to remain Jewish. And this idea that the Jewish state has now given these people a hope that there's some sort of future. Things are not going well in the 1950s. In 1952, Stalin arrests a whole bunch of Jewish doctors, basically claiming that they're planning to assassinate all of the USSR leadership. There's basically no truth behind it. They start publishing these anti-Semitic images of, these like evil Jewish doctors who are pretending to be, non-Jewish. And Stalin basically says, in response to this, we're going to deport all the Jews in Russia to Siberia. We're going to kick them all out. Anyone who even looks Jewish, anyone who pretends to be, they're going to be doing. The only blessing for the Jews is that Stalin dies. He dies before he can do this. The doctors who were arrested are released, and things kind of quiet down. But as you can imagine, that leaves a kind of stain on how safe are we as Jews in the Soviet Union. After 1967, Russia basically cuts off ties with Israel. We're in the middle of a Cold War. The US has basically decided to back Israel, which means that Russia is now going to back the Arab countries, and we're not going to support or connect anymore. And that big barrier, the Iron Gate, shuts down even further on the Jews of Russia. So Israel and also Jews around the community begin to wake up and say, we have to get the Jews out of Russia. These Soviet Jews, they are suffering, they're being treated unfairly. We need to get them into a safe space where they can be free. So we get this term refusenik, right? That they want to basically come from the idea that they want to immigrate to Israel. They want to leave Russia. Every time they fill out all the paperwork necessary, they are refused and refused and refused and refused again. Hence, they are called refuseniks. And then it would become even more. If you were someone who applied for this paperwork to leave Russia, basically you'd have to tell your work that you're applying for this paperwork. They would have to stamp off on it, and then you become a pariah at work, and then you would lose your job, and then you would lose your income. It was just never-ending cycle of you'd be stuck in Russia with no real way to leave. And the people around the world began to hear about this. And it becomes also a big part of American Jewry. In fact, the largest, until this last month, right, the largest march on Washington, 250,000 Jews marched on Washington for the refusenik cause. Now they say that's been outbroken by our most recent, during the war. One of the main figureheads of Russian Jewry and the Russian Aliyah movement is Natan Sharansky. And I'm going to actually include his wife, Avital, who I think you hear a lot less about, but again, the power of women behind the scenes. Natan Sharansky is Russian. He is arrested for being a voice of Soviet Jewry, right? He starts making causes that he wants to move. He marries Avital. And then they marry, and right away he goes into a camp in Siberia. He spends 14 years in Siberia. He writes a very famous book, Natan Sharansky. Meanwhile, while he's stuck in Siberia, Avital Sharansky travels the whole world, and she fights for his cause, makes his name famous. She gets 2,000 nearly 2,500 American scientists to state that they won't work with the Soviet Union until Sharansky is freed. She is she spends 14 years really advocating for his cause. And in the end, he is freed. And in 1986, he ends up in Israel. And he's kind of welcomed in this big hero's welcome as this key example of look at what we can do when we get together. After he's freed, he goes on a speaking tour of the United States. That's where this big rally happens. 250,000 people show up. And he meets Reagan, and they talk about what he went through. And when Reagan goes to Gorbachev, he basically says, look, I had these 250,000 people in my backyard saying, let my people go. You have to let the Jews of Russia go. Just to finish on Sharansky's story, and then we'll continue with the Gorbachev-Reagan story. Natan Sharansky will come back to Israel. He becomes a Knesset member. He writes a book. There's actually a really fascinating video he creates during COVID, if you want to go watch it, about how he dealt with life in Siberia under quarantine, basically, and how we should like use what he learned under our own quarantine, which was, I thought, an interesting comparison. He serves a lot of major chairs, the Jewish Agency he served in for a long time. So he does a lot of things with different diaspora communities around the community. In 1979 and 1980, suddenly Russia decides to start letting Jews out. Now, part of it is this pushback against it. There's also the Olympics. There's this feeling that we don't want this bad rap. And then in 1989, of course, the Soviet Union begins to crumble, the USSR begins to crumble, and Gorbachev says, finally, not everyone go, but basically go. A lot of them come to Israel. Some go to the United States, some go to Israel, and then the United States. The Jewish communities in the United States and in Israel vouch them, support them, and there is a little bit of pushback because the first kind of big rush actually goes to the United States, and there's kind of a pushback of, no, go to Israel first. We don't really want you all in the United States, so we're going to go to Israel. Between 1989 and 1994, about 1 million Soviet Jews will land in the state of Israel. And that is just a huge number. Even today, if we look at the percentages, about 1 out of every 6 Israelis is Russian. So altogether, between about 1989 and today, about 1.5 million, 1.6 million Jews and some non-Jewish spouses or relatives have come to Israel. So that is just a huge percentage of the population of Israel that had a huge impact, on the community. And it did have a huge impact because when they were in Russia, again, they had to hide their Judaism. So a lot of what they represent, for instance, I live in Kiryat Gat, and I always laugh that right now at Christmas time, there are Christmas trees everywhere. Why are there Christmas trees everywhere? They're not actually Christmas trees. For the Soviet Jews, they are just symbols of winter celebrations, right? They're not religious, but it's a cultural thing that they do. You see non-kosher stores. We actually have only 2 non-kosher grocery stores in Kiryat Gat. Both of them are Russian-owned grocery stores that sell things like pork. So there is that kind of influence there. There also was a huge impact because most of the pros and cons of communism is that most of the Russians that made Aliyah were highly educated and then had a highly educated push for their kids. So percentage-wise, Russians have a higher percentage of doctors, engineers, those kinds of white-collar jobs than the rest of the population. And that actually was kind of a pushback. For a little bit, there were actually too many. And even today, there's kind of a pushback against certain types of doctors or engineers that we don't, there's no more work as a doctor who has a degree from Russia. You have to go through and re-get an Israeli degree, in order to work here in Israel. The other stat that I always find fascinating is that today 1 in 4 Israeli professors at university is a native Russian speaker. Such like a huge percentage of our academic groups is Russian speakers. Questions about Russians? I know I just ran through the Russians and sure. Trying to be aware of our time.
Yeah.
Okay, last but not least of our 3 groups we're talking today are Ethiopian Jews. Ethiopian Jews are different from any of the groups we're talking about because they have been cut off from Jewish society for hundreds, 1,000+ years. So the Jews of Ethiopia trace their lineage back to the tribe of Dan, sometimes through King Solomon, through the Queen of Sheba. But if you know, I can't go into the whole colonialism world history bit. I'm happy to do that as a separate thing if anybody wants. But because of colonial movements, basically Ethiopia was the one country in Africa that was never really colonized, and it was separated off from most of Europe for much of what we would kind of consider this early globalization for 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. The first writings we have of Ethiopian Jews come already from the 800s. So already in the 800s, we have rabbinic writings that talk about meeting Jews in Ethiopia. So this is not a new community. This is at least 1,000+ years. The most detail we get starts in kind of the Middle Ages, in late Middle Ages, in the 1400s, maybe early Renaissance, 1400s and on. In the 1400s, there was this movement called the Responsa, which basically, before internet, people would write letters to rabbis and say, is this a true answer or not, right? I need to eat a chicken. Is it kosher kind of questions? And we actually have a whole series of responsa of these letters about whether or not Ethiopian Jews are Jewish halachically or not. And the answer in these responsa is yes. Rabbi David Ibn Zimra says that these are Jews, these are our lost tribes, and therefore we need to treat them as religious Jews. So already, even as I would say as early as even before that, but I'm sure that for the 1400s, we have show of them as Jews in Ethiopia. There are kind of two communities of Ethiopian Jews. The Beit Israel, which is what I would kind of call maybe like the traditional Ethiopian Jews, people who have, they've built Jewish communities, ghettos perhaps you might call them, in Ethiopia. They've been separated out, they face a lot of hardship. They keep Shabbat, they keep Tachar Mishpacha, family purity laws, they keep Tikkun Olam, and they have all these similar ideas to Judaism. The biggest difference is that because they've been cut off since basically ancient times, they don't keep anything that is post-Tanakh, which basically means they don't celebrate Hanukkah or Purim, because these things are all things that come after the main books of Moses. So they don't have that. And that's even some questions about their kashrut, for instance, right? What does it mean, this whole analysis of what is dairy and can you eat chicken and milk together? All these questions come post the separation, and therefore Beit Israel has some different cultural things. For instance, even Kiddush, they don't drink wine in most Beit Israel communities, so Kiddush is made over a certain kind of bread. And so therefore there are these differences in their religious aspects, but again, they are Jewish. The Fala Shmura are what we would also maybe term in other communities as Moranos. These are Jews who were forced converted or converted under duress to Christianity, and therefore they have a more complicated history here in Israel, in the sense that their Judaism is often questioned more because they've integrated into these Christian communities, but they've still kept some of their basic Jewish underneath. So they didn't celebrate Hanukkah, they didn't celebrate Purim, but they did celebrate a holiday called Sig. Sig means prostration, right? Like when you bow to the floor. And Sig celebrates the returning of the Torah and a return to Israel. So already we see in their religious history, in their culture, this longing to return to Israel, and that's very much a part of their movements. They fast on Sig, they read from the 5 books of Moses, they have their own additions that they read from, and they have they end this fast with a feast and with dancing. So this has also become less popular, but it's growing popularity here in Israel to celebrate Sig. So Ethiopian Jews have faced a lot of hardship. First of all, again, if you know anything about the general Ethiopian history, again, as I said, they weren't colonized in World War II. They did get hit. Arriving Christian missionaries basically tried to find all the Jewish communities and force convert them. And as we move on from the 1800s into the 1900s, this Jewish community gets more and more separated and harassed. Already in 1906, there's this huge push to get this Beit Israel, this Ethiopian Jewish community, under a safe area. So there are letters written from Eastern European Jews, which is a little bit ironic maybe, from the chief rabbi of London, from the Sephardic rabbi of Jerusalem, from the chief rabbi of Vienna, saying these Jews, already in 1906, these Jews of Ethiopia are being massacred and hurt in Ethiopia. We have to get them to safety. In 1921, Rabbi Kook, who you might have heard of, a very famous rabbi in early pre-state Israel, wrote that we have these 50,000 Jews in Ethiopia, and we have to save them from what he called extinction and contamination, that we have to go and we have to help these Jews. Ethiopia is invaded in 1935, which kind of cuts it off from the rest of the world, and that basically keeps them cut off until the 1970s. In 1973, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who I just mentioned, the Sephardic rabbi, he writes an official letter declaring that Ethiopian Jews are full Jews and therefore have the right to move to Israel under the law of return. And that is a huge movement. And again, the fact that the Sephardic rabbi would be the one to make that statement is also a huge impact, right? That we need to help these minority Jews and not just the Ashkenazi movement. So the question is now in the 1970s, how do we help them? what can we do, right? Ethiopia is not so far from Israel, but it's really not that close to Israel. You might have seen the movie, there was a Netflix movie called Red Sea Diving Resort. I don't know if it came out on Netflix, that was just what it did after, in which Mossad agents basically took over or most of a Sudanese diving resort, basically, and that they used it as a cover to transport Ethiopians into Israel, getting them from the resort to boats and then into Israel. There was this, like, the Sudanese were kind of, they like turned the other cheek, kind of. They thought for the most part, they didn't realize what was going on. Even when they did realize what was going on, they didn't do anything. And also other people staying at the resort didn't know what was going on under their eyes. So people like stayed at the resort as, tourists and didn't realize that all this operation was going on under their noses. Now, you might realize that if we're talking, let's say 50,000 people, which was Rav Yosef's idea, that we can't do that boat by boat by boat up the Red Sea. So we have to find a better way to do it. So in 1984, we have our first Operation Moses, which we send planes. It's through the Mossad, the CIA. Again, Ethiopia is undergoing a civil war. There's a lot of chaos in Ethiopia. And Israel airlifts 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel through Brussels, through Sudan. And then there is a huge, huge pushback. And once it gets found out, basically all the borders of the Arab countries around Ethiopia get shut down. And there's still thousands of Ethiopians stuck in Ethiopia. So I also want to emphasize that these journeys to these plane rides weren't easy. We're talking about hundreds of kilometers in desert, traveling by night, pregnant women, children. There's a lot of really amazing firsthand stories. If you want, one of my neighbors, Sharon Shalom, is a rabbi who speaks about his experience. He's a fascinating guy. He's an Ethiopian rabbi who is the rabbi to the only Ashkenazic synagogue in Kiryat Gat, and he speaks Yiddish. Because when he was brought to Israel, he had lost his family, and they basically put him into an Ashkenazic yeshiva, a study hall, in order to, I don't say whitewash him, but basically whitewash him to get him into the Ashkenazic culture. And so he's found a way to combine these two parts of himself after growing up in this Ashkenazic world and kind of reclaim his Ethiopian heritage. So this is more of the Red Sea diving resorts. The second big movement comes in 1991. In 1991, Israel reopens up this top secret movement, and they bring in 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel in 36 hours. As you can see here, in order to accommodate as many people as possible, they take all the chairs out of the airplane and they just shove everyone in as much as possible. The largest flight, they believe, was 1,086 people. So they literally, if you've ever been on a plane with like 300 people, you know how crowded it is. They just shoved people into this. Operation Solomon, these couple flights in May of 1991 will bring, about twice, just under twice the amount of people as Operation Moses. It will have the largest ones. There are babies that are born on the way. It's also hard to tell because some of the women actually hid young babies in their dresses in order to sneak them onto the planes. And so the numbers are a little unsure, but about 1,100 people were probably on the most packed plane. So since then, there have been other movements to bring Ethiopian Jews to Israel. Since 1990, it's kind of slowed to a trickle. The number of Jews in Ethiopia is getting smaller and smaller. There's also this question for Israel about whether or not all the Jews in Ethiopia are halachically Jewish and what that means. If they've converted to Christianity, as I said, do we still, allow it? But every year, a couple of hundred of Ethiopian Jews do make aliyah to Israel. And they have a ceremony. Every year, Memorial Day, there is a ceremony for Ethiopian Jews who were lost along these treks in Sudan, along these processes. Actually, here in Kiryat Gat was the very first memorial to Ethiopian Jews who were lost along that path. Ethiopian Jews face one of the most complicated stories here. And this is, look, they look different. They stand out. And there was this question of how can we fit into Israeli culture when our language is different. They speak Amharic for the most part, although not all of them. Their kosher is different. Their dress is different. They don't celebrate Purim or Hanukkah. How can we fit in a little bit? So what happened in the first generation after is there was this huge movement against following your parents' Ethiopian Judaism. We want to be like all the Israelis. We want to, shred our Ethiopianism as much as possible. We want to be a normal, quote unquote, Israeli. And I'm going to tell you just what I think is an interesting story. About 10 years ago, my neighbor, he's actually a Knesset member now, his name is Moshe Solomon, he's an Ethiopian rabbi, he noticed something. So he was this rabbi of this community, and he noticed that every morning for Shacharit, he couldn't get a minyan. But all through the rest of the day, he had lots and lots of people coming to a synagogue to pray. So he went to the men of his community, the men here in Kiryat Gat, and he said, "What's going on? Why aren't you waking up in the morning? Why aren't you coming to Shacharit to morning prayers?" And they said, "Look, we are the men of the community. We all made Aliyah from Ethiopia. We don't speak Hebrew very well. We don't have jobs, or at least they're menial labeled jobs if we do. Our kids are like the center of the household. They do all the doctor's appointments and they go to school and they're the ones with careers. You want me to wake up for Shacharit, for morning prayers, and do what all day, right? I'm not going to wake up at 8 a.m. to come to prayers and then, sit around. I'm going to wake up at noon and I'll come to afternoon prayers, and then do that." So he realized there was something missing here. So he created what's called the Beit Israel Village. It's here in Kiryat Gat. And it was a way to do two things. One was to give these men a sense of their ownership back. So he said, we're going to build a farm just like in Ethiopia. We're going to grow the same peppers. We're going to grow the same grains. We're going to cook the same food that we did in Ethiopia. And you guys are going to grow and own it and, be a productive part of society again. So that was part one. Part two was, we're going to then take this and we're going to make it a cultural center so that people can come and appreciate that Ethiopian Jews are Jews and are part of Israel. And there was this huge movement, it's actually a big center now, to not only bring in non-Ethiopian Jews, but also Ethiopian Jews. How can you respect and enjoy your culture that maybe you turned away from at the beginning because it was so different? And how can we respect that? So it's a really interesting look at how do we give that kind of organic self-reliance based on what they were used to at home. That's not to say it's all perfect. I don't want to say it's all perfect. We talk a lot in the States about, Black Lives Matter, about police violence. It does exist here in Israel. There is some racism here in Israel, but it's not to nearly the same extent that it is. There have been protests against police killings, the most famous being Solomon Teka, who was killed in 2019. For being an Ethiopian, basically a Black man, and similar to kind of the Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and there were huge protests against that. Now, it's not nearly on the same kind of scale, but I don't want to say there is no racism here in Israel. Even I'll also say, like here in Kiryat Gat, there is actually a restaurant that serves takeout food for Shabbat. So I'm going to plug in my computer, and they refuse to allow Ethiopian Jews who serve food directly, because some people thought that if Ethiopian Jews who weren't officially Jewish, even though they are, touched the food, that it wouldn't be as kosher. And there was, on the one hand, huge protests to have this. On the other hand, the protests against it, that how dare you, we're going to go to this other restaurant that allows that, were even much stronger. So there's always kind of these two sides of what does this mean. In the positive side, we have Titiana, who she speaks for JNF a lot. She was Israel's beauty queen in 2013. She speaks a lot about what it means to be Ethiopian. And I'll play one more song by Eden Elena. Those of you who have not gone down the Eurovision black hole, I can do a whole nother class on the Eurovision, but the Eurovision is kind of the ultimate in Israeli culture. Ofer Haza sang in the Eurovision, but it's always been a very big sign of what it means to be famous. Now, Eden Elaine, this was during COVID, so she actually had two songs. I'm going to play the one that never actually made it into the Eurovision because of the fact that it was COVID, but I want you to listen to both the languages she chooses to use in the song and then whatever words you might notice. So I will share that 1 second.
It'll be what the hello, no other day I love you. It'll be what the hello, no other day I love you. Once upon a time, I was looking for a sign. But your mama, showed the way, you'll be my guide. Love is on the mind, close your eyes and you will find melody, I feel the energy inside. All the people coming my way. Love is on my way. Makala kumate, makala kumate, makala kumate, makala kumate, forget have no shame, fertility. I'm not ashamed to love you tonight. I'm gonna find you. I call your name, fertility. I'll be loving you. I'm so easy. Inside your head, fertility. I'll be loving you. I will leave you. Inside me, oh heaven.
Okay, so what, do you know anything about the song? Language or sorry.
There was some English. I'm assuming there was Ethiopian. And I think at the end there was a little bit of Hebrew.
So there was Hebrew, there was Arabic, there was Amharic, and there was English. She used all four languages. And the main line she says is, "You are my heart," right? So this line that "you are my heart," and "I love you," basically in English, in Arabic, and in Hebrew, and in Amharic. And it's actually, she wrote this song as a representation. Her boyfriend at the time was an Ashkenazic Israeli, and she wrote a lot about their relationship and the challenges they faced as a biracial, cross-cultural couple, and this idea that, I don't care, I will love you anyways, even with our differences, and connecting those different languages. So she has become a huge hit. Again, I know I mentioned Kiryat Gat a lot because I live here, but she's also from Kiryat Gat, and we are clearly the coolest. So there is this, again, this movement to both recognize, to acknowledge, to appreciate that how do we celebrate Ethiopian culture and Judaism, giving them that space to celebrate themselves while still, bringing them under the umbrella of what it means to be Israeli. So I just really ran through 3 different cultures, again, each of which has their own celebrations that we could talk about for years and years. But I just want to end by saying this is also always what frustrates me when, we talk and we hear about these, these white Israelis, and go back to where you came from, and, this white colonial mindset. That is just not who we are. Again, if we look at the population we just mentioned, I guess we can put the Russians aside. I guess we consider the Russians as white. But if we don't consider the Russians as part of our population we just talked about, half the population of Israel comes from North African or Middle Eastern countries, some from this very area, all of whom basically can't go home at this point. We're talking about Iran, we're talking about Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, all these places, Egypt, all of which had hundreds of thousands of Jews in the 1940s, and then today, basically almost to a T, have a handful of Jews left in each community, sometimes as little as 1 Jew left. And the same thing with Ethiopian Jews, who there are Ethiopian Jews still in Israel, and still in Ethiopia, but they basically cannot celebrate or live their Jewish culture or their life. They are separated out. They are forced to basically live in their own little communities, and they cannot celebrate for real. So, this idea that Israel or Judaism is kind of a single thing is just something that we need to talk about. There are all sorts of movements in the States. Again, I'm decently active in some of the Sephardic ones, groups like Memuna, which talk about this Middle Eastern Jews group. So I encourage you in your areas to look up and see what kind of celebrations or acknowledgements there might be of different types of Jews. I managed to do it in an hour. I know that was a lot. I talked a lot. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them or anything related to this.